Good evening, I'm Katie Wilson and you're watching Context. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a temporary ceasefire for the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin said the ceasefire would run from the morning of the 8th of May until the 11th, which coincides with victory celebrations to mark the end of World War II. In response, Ukraine's foreign minister called for an immediate ceasefire lasting at least 30 days. But Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said it would be difficult to enter into a long-term ceasefire without first clearing up a number of questions. Ceasefires have been attempted more than 20 times in Ukraine. All of them failed eventually, and some within minutes of going into effect. The most recent one, over Easter, only resulted in a slight reduction in fighting, with both sides accusing each other of hundreds of violations. So what is Putin trying to achieve by declaring this ceasefire, and what's the likelihood that it will last? Joining me to discuss this further is Victor Rude, board member of the Ukrainian American Bar Association, and Professor Avani Vasole from the State University of New York. Thanks for joining us. So this announcement, Professor, comes as Ukraine is expected to sign a natural resources deal with the United States. But the deal doesn't include anything on concrete security guarantees, which is one of Ukraine's priorities. What are your thoughts on this?
What we can see here on the United States, and based on information from the White House, is that yes, there is nothing concrete yet about any type of ceasefire or agreement. But the fact is that since that meeting, a very brief meeting in Rome, inside the St. Peter's Basilica, a meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, we can see some movement in relation to a type of ceasefire. We don't know precisely what both presidents discussed, but what the US press is reporting is that President Zelensky said that, of course, Ukraine is ready for a ceasefire. And as you mentioned previously, Ukraine is looking for a ceasefire not of 3 or 4 days, as proposed by Russia, but a ceasefire that could be extended. But at this point, we don't have any response from the Kremlin, except news coming this morning that President Putin say, yes, we can consider the peace that Ukraine is looking for, but it's too early to formalize something along those lines. So what we can also sense here is that obviously President Trump is more and more interested in achieving some type of peace, a little bit impatient with the lack of results. And there is also some talk, especially coming from the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is that if there is no progress, United States could remove itself from the negotiations. We could generate some consequences that are unpredictable.
Thank you, Professor. So I'm going to stick with you here. And obviously this comes as the Kremlin announced a similar 30-hour truce over Easter. And while both sides reported a dip in fighting, they accused each other of hundreds of violations. How likely is it that this ceasefire is going to last?
It's difficult to say because precisely there is a lack of agreement between the parts in conflict. Yes, so United States, the government of President Trump is trying to reach some type of agreement, but the parties in conflict, they have different views about what a ceasefire would be for the president of Russia. The short ceasefire apparently is a way to reduce the hostilities in a moment that the Russian government wanted to celebrate the 8 years, right? So since the end of the World War II, but for Ukraine, the ceasefire should be much longer, considering the enormous losses of Ukraine in the battlefield and the losses for the country in general, in terms of infrastructure and lives, obviously. According to the Secretary of State, again, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State here in the United States, he recently, a few days ago, mentioned that the next few days are critical, implying with that United States government is impatient about the lack of progress in the talks, and that, again, that depending on the progress or not, United States could disengage from the process of bringing a type of agreement, a type of ceasefire. Certainly, Ukraine would like a long ceasefire, but this is not, apparently, is not coming from, it's not something coming from the Kremlin right now. The press secretary of President Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, said that it's impossible to think about a ceasefire that goes beyond what the Russian government already proposed.
So I want to come back to something that you said about the White House and their reaction to this. So the White House has noted Moscow's offer of a temporary ceasefire, but said the president has made it clear he wants to see a permanent ceasefire. You touched on this briefly, but do you think Trump is losing patience with the Kremlin?
President Trump, according to reports, are becoming very impatient with the lack of progress in these negotiations. So just to a little bit of going back, even during his campaign for the presidency in 2024, President Trump said, not once, but several times, that he could end the war in 24 hours once he would become president. Obviously, people had doubts about that, and in fact, it's very difficult because the objectives of Russia with this war and how to end the war, they do not coincide with the objectives of Ukraine. What at stake is territorial gains. Russia already put forward its demands for this war. And one of the demands is that the acknowledgement that should come from the United States, that Russia, the annexation of Crimea that took place in 2014 should be recognized as official, that Ukraine has no, Russia has no interest or no intention to return Crimea to Ukraine. But more than that, other demand of Russia is the recognition of the other regions in Ukraine that Russia is occupying now. These are 4 oblasts, type of regions in eastern Ukraine that Russia also wants to incorporate to the Russian territory. And the other demand is about security demand, is that Ukraine cannot have any presence of NATO members in its territory, and that in fact, according to the Russia demands, Ukraine cannot join NATO.
Thank you, Professor. Now, Mr. Rood, I'm going to come to you. In your view, what is Putin trying to achieve by declaring this ceasefire? Is it a genuine attempt to secure peace, or is it a public relations exercise to impress President Trump?
No, it's not just to impress President Trump, but most of the Democratic West. And you should be aware that he has also coordinated a massive march in Washington, D.C. at the same time, ostensibly to show the joinder of Moscow and Washington as long-term allies, and that should be the future path. This is very, very ironic, obviously, because it was precisely World War II and the result of that war that was fought for the purpose of enforcing the old Westphalian order of sanctity of territory and national sovereignty. And yet, at the same time, President Trump is repeating Putin's talking points about the so-called peace discussions. And I have to emphasize that 98% of the media coverage on this issue misses the most important point. And that is, the issue is not a peace discussion or negotiation or agreement, because every single issue on the table, every single one, has been agreed to for many, many decades after World War II. International law and what we call the international system has already established boundaries, punishment for war crimes, for genocide, reparations, limitations on what should be limitations on Russia, the same kind that Putin and Trump are trying to impose on Ukraine. It is a 180-degree reality reversal, treating the target and the victim of international aggression as the aggressor, punishing that. We have to understand this is not a question or a war about territory. We talk about Crimea, we talk about eastern provinces in Ukraine. That is only under the surface. Ukraine, as I have said before, I should say Russia, excuse me, is the largest country in the world. Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan can easily fit into only one sub-region of Russia. Adding Crimea and the 4 provinces to Russia only gives it, at my calculation, if I remember correctly, 0.03% additional territory. That's not the purpose of the war. The purpose of the war was declared many, many years ago by Russia, and nobody is discussing this. If you're going to have a settlement agreement, a peace agreement, you have to know what the issue is. And the issue is for Moscow, and it has been, to use Ukraine as the pivot point to turn the world upside down as we knew it precisely since World War II. And to get the United States in particular into a position of walking away of all of the achievements of World War II that I had mentioned to you. I necessarily, and in a summary fashion, national sovereignty. So the question becomes, for Putin, what is the best way to demonstrate that? Well, why not celebrate everything that World War II was ostensibly about, because it then makes them even more and more innocent. The other reason, the short-term reason, is he is afraid of having Ukrainian drones possibly flying over Moscow, attacking Moscow and the parade and the like, and he cannot afford to have that when he has an international audience. The last point I want to make is the big push that Russia has made about World War II over the last maybe 40 or 50 years is to turn it around not as a victory by the nations of the Soviet Union, including Azerbaijan and other countries that were so-called Soviet republics, but to make this a specifically Russian victory. Nobody knows, for example, that oil from Baku, petroleum products, fuel, was given by Moscow to Berlin to fuel air attacks and the bombing of London. There is a long history of World War II we're not aware of. Putin is aware of it, and he wants the legitimization by the West and Western leaders who attend of a rewritten history of so-called Russian victory. It wasn't Russian at all.
I want to roll back to something that you touched upon, which was President Trump and the White House and their ability as a peace broker. So obviously not only is this Victory Day, but it's also Trump is marking 100 days of his second term. And we still haven't seen an end to the war in Ukraine, despite Trump vowing to have it solved within one day. So what does this tell us about Trump's credibility as that peace broker?
Well, in my estimation, it says absolutely nothing. He has become not an intermediary, not a mediator, but an advocate for Putin, repeating Putin's talking points. And then when he agrees to them, Russia then increases the demands.
Do you have the sense that the White House is losing patience with the Kremlin?
Excuse me?
Do you have the sense that the White House is losing patience with the Kremlin?
Honestly, no. There was, of course, the tweet by President Trump about the fact that Putin should not be sending missiles and bombing in Ukraine and for Putin to move along. But I do not believe that impatience will lead to anything constructive other than possibly Trump pulling away from the negotiations, which would be, I think for Ukraine actually would be good because the United States has made the situation much more difficult. On the other hand, of course, Trump may consider that does not make him look good. So consequently, he will, I think, ultimately blame Zelensky, the victim. I have to emphasize that we are seeing a reversal of every single position and every single achievement that we have had since World War II through not just Putin's reversal, but Trump's reversal of all of those achievements through several generations with these so-called peace discussions.
Do you think Trump has any ability to make Putin listen?
He has the ability. He had the golden ability on day one of his presidency. He could have not just continued, but increased aid to Ukraine, and Putin would have backed off. I'm sure that he would have, for reasons I'm happy to discuss. There's the issue, of course, of nuclear intimidation and everything else. But he, I believe, is too much committed to Russia with his own grandiose ideas of having a Trump Tower in Moscow, of business relations with Russia as before. You have to ask your questions. Why does his envoy to Moscow, Witkoff, visited Moscow several times and spent innumerable hours with Putin, each time coming back and then Trump repeating Putin's talking points as compared to, as a true intermediary or mediator, Witkoff also going to Ukraine. That never happened. Mm-hmm. I consider President Trump either willingly, unwillingly, consciously, or unconsciously, as an asset that being used and manipulated by the Kremlin to finish a war against Ukraine that they have been unable to do so in more than 11 years, since 2014.
Now, Trump has raised the possibility of imposing new sanctions on Russia following its attack on Kyiv last week. Do these threats still have any effect on the Kremlin, and what do you make of this as a response?
Well, I will believe it if I see it. So far, these are only words. If you compare how Trump's reaction has been to Putin lately, as I said, basically the tweet to Putin to stop bombing Ukraine and the so-called threat of sanctions and secondary sanctions, compare that response, the length of it, the strength of it, and the method of communication over a tweet, compare that to his dealing with, addressing, and treating Zelensky, including kicking the president of Ukraine out of the Oval Office. You cannot compare the two, and consequently, I cannot believe the seriousness of that threat, because that would mean that Trump truly understands what the issue is and wants to take a position that will be consistent with protecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. There's no talk about children. Hundreds of thousands of children, some of them have been tortured, infants and children have been tortured, people. There is a 27-year-old journalist, a Ukrainian journalist, who was abducted by the Russians. Her body was returned. It weighed 30 kilograms. A 27-year-old woman. Her eyes were gouged out, her brain was removed, and her larynx was removed as well. These are messages to the West. That does not move, it does not affect Trump. And ironically, he is now following the same steps of Putin, saying, well, the United States should annex Greenland. Canada should be the 51st state. You see an incredible parallel that is totally inconsistent with him ever imposing sanctions or taking any serious measures against Russia.
So how is the Kremlin reacting to, as you say, those parallels that you pointed out? And do you think we're still feeling the effects of the Oval Office conversation that you touched upon, despite us seeing Trump and Zelensky talking at the Vatican?
Well, first of all, I think Putin cannot be other than totally delighted at how things have progressed. I don't think he's at all impressed and doesn't see any possibility that Trump would actually reverse himself 180 degrees. I just don't see anything positive coming out of this at all.
Now looking ahead to this proposed ceasefire, the Kremlin announced a similar 30-hour truce over Easter, and both sides did report a dip in the fighting, but they accused each other of hundreds of violations. So in your view, how likely is it that this ceasefire is going to last?
Well, not long at all, and you have to look at the history. The way we try to predict the future, anticipate the future, and answer your question is to look at the past. What happened with Minsk I and II when Russia originally invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea in 2014? And unfortunately, the press often presents this as, well, there were violations by Ukraine, there were violations by Russia, and who knows what happened, and people just don't comply with ceasefires. We have to understand that there is no country in the world that wants peace and a ceasefire than Ukraine. 50 days have passed since Zelensky agreed to what the United States wanted, an unconditional ceasefire. It has been proposed for 30 days. That has been rejected by Putin. When Putin rejected it, what did Trump do? What did he say? Nothing. For 50 days, he has accepted not only Putin's rejection of the American proposal, but has been repeating increasingly more and more demands by Russia. That is a typical Russian negotiation tactic that has been in place for centuries as Russia expanded its empire, including into the Caucasus area, including Azerbaijan and other nations throughout the former Soviet Union, and now those non-Russian nations that exist as part of the Russian Federation.
Thank you. Now, we are running out of time, so to finish off, I'm going to finish on Professor Visle. Now, tell me your predictions for this ceasefire. Are you optimistic that it's something that might last? How do you think it's going to unfold?
In my view, there is an impasse in these negotiations, and we have to consider what is going on in the global context. Yes, as was mentioned previously, we are possibly going to a different world order now, very different from the one that was built precisely 80 years ago at the end of World War II. And this world order is also we cannot predict how it's going to be, but it seems that the great powers, United States, Russia, and China, are the ones that are going to position themselves as leaders.
I'm very sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there as we are out of time. Thank you so much to you both for joining us. Now, that brings this episode of Context to a close. This latest announcement comes during what the US has described as a very critical week for Russia-Ukraine peace talks. Washington has been trying to broker a deal between the two sides, but the Trump administration has threatened to pull out if they do not see progress. Putin is keen to create the impression that Russia is serious about seeking peace, and he is keen for Trump to hear that message, given Ukraine has accepted Washington's proposal for a more lasting 30-day ceasefire. We'll keep bringing you the latest developments on A News. Bye for now.